Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Sec Tech Podcast. You may notice that I am not Matt Lemke. I am Kenn Williamson. Matt had his baby. Congratulations to him. So he's taking some time off. And so it's me, and we're bringing back a guest to be a guest host, JD Davis, who has been working with me on various projects and is a really talented developer. How you been, JD?
Busy.
Yeah.
Those holidays, they just are a blur. Every year, they just kind of come and go, and you feel like you accomplish everything and nothing simultaneously. So.
Oh, I know. And just like all of that planning and everything leading up to it, and then you get through and you're like, what happened? Where did all the time go?
Yep. Just a blur.
Yeah. Well, today we wanted to talk about like side work, side hustles, and the gig economy. The reality is that, software developers aren't, like poorly paid at all, but things being what they are, everybody feels like they, need a little bit extra. And so today we wanted to talk about, how does that work? And, it was really fortuitous because you're coming on. You're someone that does some consulting on the side in addition to your main job. I don't really do any work on the side, but I do a lot of volunteering with my church. So, what do you think about that? Like, what do you think about software developers that are having an additional job? Maybe not a full-time job, just working contract or whatever. How does that work for you? And what are some of the benefits and some of the problems that you see with it?
It's a mixed bag. So overall, working just a general salary job, you have your expectation of you've got your 40 hours a week and so much work that needs to be done. And it becomes a question of, if you're doing gig work, is your main job being sacrificed? Or even are you, is there a conflict of interest? You've got your standard working hours. But since we've started to move to more of a remote gig economy or remote work economy, it's kind of a little interesting because, I spent most of my career working in an office. And I don't know about most developers, but I would say when I was in an office, an average, I'd say 60% of my day was spent on things I would call not productive. Like I was actively working on things. I was in meetings. I was in calls. But there was a lot of downtime. There was a lot of thinking that was happening. There was a lot of just not actively code being produced. Where when you start working remotely, you start recognizing that downtime because what do? You're like, oh, I'm going to go let my dogs outside while I'm thinking about this. So I'm going to go, start cooking my lunch. Or I'm going to turn around and hit print on my 3D printer because I've got 5 minutes. And as you start to work kind of these remote jobs, it becomes a question of, am I using my time most effectively? Because, we are paid very well for what we do comparatively. And you start to say, hey, I'm only utilizing 60% of the hours that I'm being allocated. Could I do something else with those other hours? And it becomes a kind of a ethical question, I think, because is it right for you to kind of double dip that way, or is it even double dipping if you're still getting your main job done?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and for for some people, I'm sure they're really. Isn't a conflict that much. Well, let me back up. One thing is that with remote work, hours are kind of flexible. And so if I need to, if I'm doing, well, in my case, like say I need to meet somebody up at the church to help with something and that needs to be, at 11 in the morning, in the old days, you would be at the office and you would talk to your boss and you would get that time off. Now I would, maybe just go run and do that so long as I don't have any meetings planned and then just make up that time at the end of the day. And really not see any issues. And I'm sure it's similar for you in what you do. But you mentioned the double dipping, and I think that if you're working straight for a company that the product that you're working on, it's probably, in my mind, not that big of a deal because I don't know that they're as interested in you working exactly 40 hours every single week so much as are you meeting deadlines? Is the team being productive? And I'm not speaking, I'm not a hiring manager, I'm not a dev manager, I'm not speaking for anybody, but that's just my sense. But then the question for people like us kind of becomes when you're working for a company that's consulting with other companies, and a lot of times they're billing on quote unquote your hours. Well, that I think that really does bring in that ethical question that you're bringing up. What do you think about that?
Morally, I think it's wrong to double dip. I don't think like anyone should have, if you've got, a full-time job, there's no way that you're, putting in 100 hours a week of work, like 120 hours extra beyond your 40 hours a week. It just doesn't happen. So if someone starts looking and you said, I've billed 40 here, 40 here, 40 here, someone's going to look at that and say something's not starting to add up. But on the other hand, working remotely, you have the kind of pleasure that a lot of your folks are not necessarily in your time zone. You may be working with folks on the East Coast or West Coast, and so your day may not be starting until noon your time. And so you've got all those hours in the morning where, it's not maybe productive to work on your main 40-hour salaried gig, and it makes more sense to, go work with a contracting company, sell a couple hours there that you have free, you're awake anyways, and that seems to be a bit more, to me, fine. You're not double dipping, you're just utilizing that time more effectively. And I think that's kind of the area you have to work in is, we all have those downtimes during the day, but can you effectively say, in that downtime, I did something productive for X company or Y company, and you start to kind of itemize and bill your time as you're sitting there. And that's what kind of happened to me is I am working a remote gig, and it is sort of consulting where I'm billing my time to customer projects. But so much of that is I'm meeting with customers at 9 p.m. I'm meeting with customers at 11 a.m. And then again, I have to go and wake up at 2 a.m. and meet with their folks in Germany or the folks in Japan. And so I've gotten to the point where anytime I'm working on a project now, I've got a time tracker. And it doesn't matter if I'm taking a phone call or a meeting or I'm writing code, I'm constantly tracking that time. And that's where I started learning exactly how much of my time I wasn't utilizing effectively. And I was like, what can I do to utilize this time effectively? It started out with personal projects, and I'm like, well, if I'm not able to work on what my job needs me to work on in this time frame, well, then I'll work on some open source stuff that, contribute back to the community. And that was nice for a few months. And then it just turns out, sometimes you want to get paid for your work. And that's where it gets to be an effective use of your time to maybe look at some of those things that you can do, maybe Upwork or, pick up a little bit of hours here or there. And to me, that's fine. But it's the double dipping you got to be very cautious about.
No, I mean, I completely agree with everything you said there. Especially on the contracting side, it's very important that you are being honest and straightforward with the time that you're spending, because your company is really, you're representing them. And if you are misrepresenting what you're doing for them, then you are also doing not only a disservice to their customer, but to them.
And you're committing fraud.
Yeah, and you're committing fraud, exactly. So, it's a fine line, but then you kind of get into the question of what exactly constitutes time spent on a particular project. And in my experience for software, it's kind of a hard question to answer. And you think of it similarly to like a lawyer, right? Like a lawyer is going to take a 5-minute phone call and bill you for 15 minutes. And that's standard practice, and nobody blinks an eye about that. Do you think this similar thing applies for software? Or, I know we've talked about in the past that software is a little bit more like a trade, but in a lot of respects, it is like some of these professional things too, where there's a lot of thinking. Like sometimes the work that you're doing for a project, for a customer, is thinking through details of things that they're doing, and it may not be physically writing out things. It may not be actually writing code or implementing things. What do you think about that as far as what constitutes really working and what you would consider to be billable?
I think your lawyer analogy is spot on. If you can actively say you are dedicating your time and energy working towards something, I think that's perfectly reasonable to bill for. You don't actively need to be writing code. There's times I'll go spend a lunch period, and the whole entire lunch I'm sitting there mindlessly eating, but I'm thinking, how can I design this software? How can I architect this? I'm decompressing and processing what I had just had a meeting over prior to this lunch. And so in a lot of times, those I consider a productive use of my time. I'm eating, but I'm thinking, I'm planning, I'm coming up with things. And immediately after that lunch, it's used. I start building code and designing things. Now, that design time would have had to happen regardless if I was eating or not. And so that question comes down, well, you were eating, you were multitasking. And I think it comes down to we're always multitasking in this career. And so you start to just, it's what makes sense to you, and it's what makes sense to your customers. And I think that that's the biggest thing in this field is if you trust your customers and your customers trust you, then you're going to be able to come to an agreement what's billable time or not. And that's where a lot of the, I think, friction comes, is because a lot of developers go to these back rooms and we're a little black box and out comes productive code, but a lot of people don't really see what's happening. They don't see how the sausage gets made. And so that's where we kind of have to have some clear communication, say, yes, I'm actively working on this. I'm thinking about it. I'm not writing code, but I am. And that's where if you can defend your decisions and your time using that, then I think that's perfectly fine. But it's when you start to have to make excuses for those times and start to have to, you're trying to weasel around it, that it gets to be a little bit shady, a bit.
No, I mean, I think you're spot on there. It's you know, and I think you brought up the biggest key for me is communication. You know, I think that it's up to you and your employer and your customer to have a meeting of the minds to understand what exactly is, you know, are the expectations as far as these things go in billable time, you know, and that if they want, I completely agree with what you said as far as if I'm thinking about the project or the product that I'm working on, and I'm not doing anything else that I'm billing for, then that's billable time, right? Even if I may be, you know, like you say, eating something or you know, letting the dog out or whatever that may be, you know. But then it comes back to the double dipping, and then something else that you mentioned before we started, when we were prepping, was that you know of, or maybe know, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but at least know of some people that are subcontracting out their work. And, you know, that to me is starting to get into a little bit, you know, shadier business practice. Obviously, if everybody's aware of exactly what's happening, then there's no issue whatsoever, right? Like, I mean, that's really what a consulting firm is doing. You know, like if I'm consulting for a customer, like they know that it's not, you know, my boss is not sitting down and writing code. You know, they understand that, right? But you know, sometimes the subcontracting, you know, maybe is a little under the radar. What do you think about all that? Like, is it just, you know, the work speaks for itself, and whatever pathway to successful code is good, or is it something where it's you know, maybe not a desirable business practice, and that, you know, these people probably should figure something else out?
I think it's probably one of the biggest gray areas in our field right now.
Yeah.
I've heard of, and I know personally of a couple folks, but I've even heard the stories of, you know, someone working in Silicon Valley, and they've got 3 full-time jobs that are remote, and, you know, they only pay a little bit of time for this one and a little bit of time in this one, but they have people working offshore, or even, you know, local developers that are kind of subcontracting for them. And, you know, they're able to sit here and manage this for years at a time, and I can't fathom it. I haven't been able to work at a company that there's that little oversight that my quality of work could be garbage, and they'd allow that. So I'm a bit confused of how it flies under the radar like that, but it starts to set a question in my mind of what is the culture for some of these places where the folks work. Is it a culture of we're just, you know, we see you as a productive resource, and, you know, whatever you're producing is all we care about? Or is it a culture of we take interest in you as a cultural, as a community, as a person, and we want to see what you're doing and improving and growing? And so, you know, I'm kind of the mind, if you're working in a firm that's a bit more like a factory, you're just producing widgets and you're putting code out, ethically and morally, I still think subcontracting that out without the full, you know, approval and understanding of everyone is wrong. But at the same time, I can see how, as long as it's getting done, it doesn't matter. You know, and the company has put a price that they're willing to pay for that work to be done, doesn't matter. It takes me back to something I had happen earlier last year. I had a tree removed on my property. I went out and had a whole bunch of contractors come out and bid on it, and then finally we accepted a bid. And then we had another, that person that we accepted the bid from, they sent another contractor out to cut our tree down. Turns out the person that gave us the bid, they don't even cut down trees. They do gardening, and then that was all they do. And, you know, we felt a little bad because they paid the person to remove that tree $1,000 less than we paid them to remove the tree. But in my mind, we were already fine paying that amount to remove the tree. So, it feels a little wrong and a little underhanded that they subcontracted it out through the guys that they were going to be the ones doing it. But at the end of the day, they took the insurance out, they took the liability, and it was all on them to begin with. So if it went wrong, it was the primary company that we hired. It was on them. And so that's kind of, I look at the same way with developing. If you're going to subcontract your work out, that's okay. Not really, but okay. But if something goes wrong, it's on you. You can't throw your subs under the bus. You can't say, oh, sorry, I had these guys working on it. I mean, you've got to understand that you're taking a risk, and it's one that you're going to have to accept one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think your analogy is great. I had a similar experience when I was doing some renovation on the house, and I had a guy that runs a contracting business come out, praise the work, give me the bid, and then when it came time to do the work, he had another worker that was a subcontractor of his that actually did the work, and it's exactly like you say. And then when the job was done and there were a few details that needed to be managed that weren't completely done the way that that we had agreed on, he came in and he took care of those details. And I don't know that I have a big problem with that. And so you see that analogy when you're talking about software. And so I think you're exactly right. It is a little bit of a gray area. Like it's hard to say, and and it kind of gets back into the billing question, right? Like, so if they are asking me for 40 hours a week and I have somebody else that's working 40 hours a week, they're happy with the work product, is really anybody harmed? I mean, this is a difficult question. My sense is that it doesn't quite feel right to me. Like, to me, it should be completely transparent. And in both of our scenarios, it was completely transparent, right? Because we saw the person coming out and doing the work, and so we were fully aware. Hey, this isn't the guy that I originally contracted with. And we you knew that they were insured and that they were going to be responsible for the work product either way. A lot of times some of these guys in the software world aren't doing that same sort of thing. They're not insuring their work. If one of their subcontractors, worker bees, made a big mistake, maybe they're responsible and they get fired, but that really doesn't help the company, right? And the company really doesn't have any recourse to go after them. And, even if you were going to try to sue them for fraud or something like that, they probably don't have, the company really doesn't have any way to get their money back in case something goes wrong. And in my mind, that kind of makes it so that it's a little bit darker gray at the very least, if not, explicitly something that we don't want to encourage. So, it's a difficult topic, right? Because the reality is that we're living in a time of a lot of uncertainty. We're living in a time, I mean, I don't think I'm breaking anybody's brains to say that inflation is much bigger concern than it has been in the past. Especially talking about the things that people spend the most money on: housing, food, and energy. These are all things that are inflating. And so people, have to try to find ways to make their money go farther, but they also have to look at ways on how to make more money, how to work smarter, essentially. Sure. And so, it's well, what do you think about that? I mean, do you think that it's reasonable for these subcontractors to do this, or is it something that the since they don't really have a recourse for their customer, that it's probably not a good practice?
I think at the high level, if you have a salaried job, 40 hours a week, I think there's no gray area there. Yeah. I think it's black and white. If someone's paying you for your time, they're paying for your expertise. They've run the I-9s. They've done all the taxable stuff on you. It's you. Anything else to me, would be, at least if it's not fraud, it rhymes with it.
Yeah.
Now, on the other side, if you're, kind of doing like what I do on the side sometimes, where I do my main salary job, but I also do contract work, but I do it all under my LLC. And I bill through my LLC, but my LLC is my business. It is, hey, if I mess something up, it's going to reflect on that company. It's going to reflect on me, and then financially, it's going to hit me. If I hire a subcontractor to do the work, they're still only doing it through my LLC, which is where I've got a contract with whoever I'm doing work with. And so, I have that entity, that thing there that everyone has agreed this is who's doing it. It's not JD. I mean, you're paying JD, but you're paying my LLC to do the work. That was where I think it's okay to subcontract those things out, as long as everyone is at least aware. You've had that discussion. But I think that's kind of where I draw the line myself personally, and that's where I would put it as a, if you want to subcontract out things that are contract, that's one thing. But you can't really subcontract out things that are a job.
Yeah.
I don't know how to put that.
No, I mean, and I think that that's probably a good way to look at it. If you're a full-time employee, for one thing, your company is giving you benefits in most cases, insurance, 401k, whatever that may be, they're not giving you those benefits. You're not forwarding those benefits on to somebody else that you're offshoring. So that you're offshoring with. It's definitely so. I think that that's a really good way to look at it. And to me, the biggest key that we can say is the transparency. If everybody knows what's going on, it's obvious. If you are hiding what you're doing, chances are you shouldn't be doing it. And so it's but it's a difficult question. So let's switch gears a little bit. Let's say that you had an opportunity. And that you were going to not be able to put the time forward, but you knew what to do. You knew somebody that you thought you could subcontract with. How would you bring that up to a prospective client? To have that conversation, to make it transparent. What do you think that you would say, or what do you think is a good way of approaching that? If you were going to try to do this the right way, do it up front, how would you approach that?
I think it primarily depends on what your personal outcome out of that situation is. Do you want to, subcontract out a portion of your work and get compensated for that portion that you're subbing out, or do you just want to hand over a portion of the work and have someone else do it? In both cases, I think you need to be very transparent and very upfront with the company and just simply have the first conversation. Say, hey, I am beyond my capacity. I can't take on any more work right now, and frankly, I don't think I can do what you've assigned me to the best of my abilities, to which you're paying me to do. And that's when I discuss the option. I have X number of developers that I can bring in, either onshore or offshore. I will review that work and make sure that it's good. And then you can still continue to pay me, and I make sure everyone's dispersed. That's, to me, is one option. The other option to that would be simply, hey, I can no longer look over this, but I can technically manage it. Would you be fine bringing in another contractor, and then you would pay them directly? And then I would take my small, 1 or 2 hours cut to do any reviews or rectification of the code. To me, that's a good way of doing it. The wrong way of doing it would simply be continuing to say, hey, I billed you 40 hours a week and here's the work, and who knows where it came from. Yeah,
I mean, I think that's exactly right. And to me, the gig economy is something that's here to stay. It's not going away, and I think that it's going to accelerate. And I think that we are going to have more discussions around the norms and expectations of the gig economy, subcontracting. Something that we didn't touch on that I'd like your thoughts on is, how much would be too much. Like something that we didn't really bring up, but I think that is important, is that people have limited bandwidth. If I'm working a 40-hour-a-week job and I take on a second 40-hour-a-week job, then, it's diminishing marginal returns. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like the first hour that I work is much more productive than the 80th hour that I work.
Absolutely.
And so, how do you think that if you are getting a contract job, that you need to disclose that you already have a full-time job? Talk a little bit about what you think about that, and what would maybe be the limits around what's appropriate for one person to do.
Personally, I think it's the nature of the contract. So, there are contract roles out there that they say, hey, we need you to be a full-time contract employee. We're expecting 40 hours a week out of you. At that point, with that, I think it's up to the person to ask themselves, can I reasonably do 2 full-time jobs and give them my best? I think if you say yes, you're lying to yourself, but you have to ask yourself, can you do this and dedicate that? And once you've taken the answer to that, then you need to go to the company and say, hey, here's the full picture. I can either do the work, but it needs to be structured in such a way that it's, the work that's coming to me is ready to be done. You don't need the work that's I'm sitting here planning and thinking about, because it probably won't be done to the satisfaction. So a lot of that depends on the nature of the work that you're doing, but it also depends on the company. So if there's a culture at that company to, they've got business consultants, they've got analysts, and everybody's just handing you stacks of basically filled out forms saying, hey, we need you to write code that adheres to this, then I think that it would be reasonable that someone likely could have a second full-time job, just hammering out code. Much like you could have a person who builds fences on the side sit there and their day job be a contractor that builds fences. They can probably build fences on the weekend just fine without any issues because they have the plan. They don't have to think about it, and it's not that much energy, right? There's a difference between what I want to say like mental workload and actual physical workload. There's a difference between thinking about doing things and physically doing them, and sometimes the thinking about doing them is way, way, way harder than just doing it. And so that's where a lot of folks you start to think, hey, how can I get this back a little bit here? With that company, for example, with SecTech, right? I say, hey, I'm working. This is my primary gig. This is where my energies go, and I'm very upfront with. There's a conflict here. There's a conflict there. I need to take this time, or I need a mental break, or I need to step back. But the conversation also flows into, do you all need me to step back over here and put more energy in? Do I need to bunker down a little extra certain weeks to make sure things get pushed over that hump? And so that's where we kind of come back to communication. I think you can do it. I think you can reasonably do it, but it depends on full open communication between the person doing the work and the company that they're doing the work for. Just like someone building my fence. They may have a full-time job. I may not expect that fence to be up in a single weekend. It may take them 3. Whereas if I had them doing it during their normal hours, their normal rates, it may have been done in a week.
No, I mean, I think that those are all really great points. I really love what you said about the difference between, being just a coder and being maybe more of an architect, more of a reviewer. I think that I think you really hit it there where, if it's I don't think it's reasonable to think that you can be at the top of your game on designing, on architecting, on making these difficult decisions, on coordinating a lot of this stuff. I think it would be rather difficult to be on your game for 80 hours a week doing that. But if you were doing that for, 30, 40 hours a week, and then you had another 40 hours of just mechanically give me requirements, I'll give you code. I mean, I think you're exactly right. It's very reasonable. And, I don't think that this is the last word. And if people disagree with us, we'd love to hear from you. We're just starting this conversation, but I think it's an important conversation because I think as time goes on, one thing I think that the number of full-time employees that companies have in this space is going to reduce because I think companies are realizing that internal employees sometimes have a difficult time taking on new projects and doing things, that we had talked about it with Matt last week, where companies are realizing that bringing in talent to accomplish a specific goal sometimes is a much better path than trying to have your internal team do it. And you really want your internal team to be more about making sure things are working, making sure that small feature requests and data and everything is working. And so I think these questions are going to become more and more important as this expands, as companies are using more contractors, as the gig economy continues to grow, which it's already very big. So we're kind of getting towards the end here, and I just want to thank you so much for coming and filling in for Matt. We want to give a shout out to Matt in Dadland. I'm sure you're tired. I'm sure you're stressed, but we're just so happy for you. And just congratulations on starting this amazing journey. JD is also a father, and so he knows what it's all about. JD, do you want to just get the last word and close us out with any final thoughts?
All I can say out there is congrats to Matt, and congrats on that sleep you're definitely not having right now. So I hope it doesn't blur together too much for you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you everyone for listening. We're going to be back in a couple of weeks again, and we'll see if Matt's ready. If not, we'll carry on without him until he's ready to get back. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time.